So here we are at chapter 20, which is all about the urinary system. And in this first lecture, we're going to look at the functions and the anatomy of the kidney. So the functions of the urinary system and then the anatomy of the kidney by looking first at its structure and then at the blood supply to it. So when we think about the functions of the urinary system, well, of course, topping the list would be excretion, the removal of materials that we don't want in blood or body fluids and getting it out of the blood. And so we get rid of the nitrogenous wastes that are produced as we metabolize proteins and nucleic acids, two chemicals in the body that are high in nitrogen. We get rid of salts, other toxic ions that can build up in the blood or in body fluids, as well as any other chemicals that don't belong in the body. So we remove pharmaceuticals, for instance, and other kinds of drugs from the blood by the kidneys as well. So we get all that stuff out of the blood, and then we can tuck it down in the urinary bladder, and it's stored there awaiting elimination, which is then the discharge of these waste products as we urinate and get rid of the urine that we're holding there in the urinary bladder. A third function would be homeostasis in body fluids. So we maintain appropriate concentrations of electrolytes and water in the body thanks to the urinary system. And we can in part regulate the pH of our blood as well as the blood volume through the urinary system. And then last of all, regulation is a very important role that the urinary system plays. We've already talked about erythropoietin, EPO. When the blood is low on oxygen, then the kidneys will produce EPO in response, and then that acts as a signal, that hormone acts as a signal to the red bone marrow to then produce more red blood cells. So we see erythropoiesis in response to erythropoietin in the blood. Renin is another hormone that's produced by the kidneys, and so we will see its function in a later lecture. And then there is a role with activating vitamin D, and so we've already talked about the importance of vitamin D in the nutrition chapter with absorbing calcium from the food that we eat, and so activating that vitamin D to help encourage the body to absorb calcium is very important. So where do we find the kidneys? They are positioned in a location that's described as retroperitoneal. Retro, that means that it's posterior to the peritoneal cavity, so it's outside of the parietal peritoneum. And so here we're looking at a slice that's right through the liver and across the top of the stomach, and you can see here's the kidneys have been sliced right across the top, and here would be where this black line kind of exhibits where the parietal peritoneum would be, and so notice that the kidneys are outside of that peritoneal cavity. That means that they don't have the protection afforded by peritoneal fluid, and so instead they are packed up in adipose tissue that helps prevent them from being bumped and jarred around. The left kidney is found slightly higher than the right kidney, so left kidney high, right kidney ever so little bit lower, and both the kidneys are covered by a dense, irregular connective tissue capsule termed the renal capsule, also called the tunica fibrosa. So that name kind of points out the construction of it with all of the protein fibers that we associate with dense, irregular connective tissue. And if you look at the kidney sort of as a kidney bean, here where the eye of the black-eyed pea would be is a structure that's referred to as the hilum. So where else in the anatomy of the body did we see a capsule and a hilum? Hopefully you're thinking the lymphatic system and the lymph nodes. So the structure, or the shape, I guess, of the kidney is very similar to that of the lymph node. So the hilum is positioned medial. It's a concave depression at the kidney surface, but it's also the place where we see the renal artery supplying blood to the kidneys, the renal vein taking that blood supply away, where the ureter collects the urine and then exits the kidney, is right there at the hilum, and it's also the spot where a nerve can travel into the kidney as well. So if you slice the kidney longitudinally, then you get this sort of image here, and you would notice that there's like a hollow area central in the kidney, and that area is referred to as the renal sinus. Remember, a sinus is a cavity. Generally we think about sinuses being in bones, but they can be, it's any cavity could be referred to as a sinus that way. Lining the renal sinus is connective tissue called the renal pelvis. It's the same material that makes up the ureter, or some of the ureter. So it's this expanded connective tissue that lines the renal sinus and acts as the collecting point for all the urine. So urine collects in the small little cups here, or funnels. Those are the minor calyces, and then is funneled to these larger kind of funnely tubes there of the renal pelvis. Those are the major calyces, and in this way the urine is funneled toward the ureter, and so it collects there within the pelvis and then is washed down the ureter. The central portion of the kidney, so here everything that I've outlined in red, is referred to as the renal medulla. Medulla, think middle. And it is composed of tissue that we refer to as the renal columns. So here are the renal columns, and the book shows them having a kind of a stripy appearance, and you'll see some of that when we do hopefully you saw it when we did dissections. That stripiness is caused by all of the collecting ducts that are bringing the urine that they've been involved in making down toward the renal pelvis. The outer rind of the kidney is termed the renal cortex, and cortical material, cortex material, kind of makes its way between the renal pyramids, and there we describe that cortical material dropping down between the pyramids as the renal columns. That provides a pathway for blood vessels. We'll see that in just a second. Okay, so now we're to the business, the part of the kidney that actually makes the urine, and that's the nephron. So it's the functional unit of the kidney, and within one kidney there's something on the order of 1.25 million nephrons. So we got lots and lots of nephrons, and they are the business end of all of this. So before we can look at the structure of the nephron and its function, we need to look at how we get blood to the nephron, and because that's, it's the blood that the nephrons are responsible for filtering all the waste materials out of. The kidney processes, depending on the activities of the body, between 15% of cardiac output, that would be if you're engaged in some physical work, up to something on the order of 30%. So almost a third of the blood that's being pumped out of the heart when we are in rest and digest mode is being sent to the kidneys. That's a lot of blood, my friends. So the renal artery is what supplies that blood. So blood comes in here at the renal artery, and then the artery branches and branches until eventually we form these small interlobar arteries. So this red, sorry about that, my pad fell for a second. This red line that I'm drawing is trying to follow the red interlobar artery. The interlobar artery is traveling up through the renal column, that cortical material that's in between the renal pyramids. So up at the top of the renal pyramids, then, the interlobar artery becomes the arcuate artery because it arches across the top of the renal pyramid, and then that leads to little offshoots that radiate away from the arcuate arteries, and those are referred to as the cortical, because they are in the cortex, radiate arteries, because they radiate away from the arcuate arteries. Now, we are not quite ready to look at a nephron, but you've got to work with me a little bit because we're trying to get blood supply to the nephron. So the blood then makes it to very tiny, those cortical radiate arteries will branch, forming tiny little afferent arterioles. So these afferent arterioles, afferent means they're heading toward a structure. The structure that they're heading toward is the glomerulus. Glom meaning like a little wad well, the wad is a wad of little capillaries that are found in a structure termed the renal corpuscle. So I know these are terrible words, but practice spelling them, you'll get good at it. So that glomerulus is this network of capillaries, and it's found inside nephron tissue, so it's kidney tissue that this cardiovascular tissue is found inside. And as blood flows through the glomerulus, then it, on the far side of that capillary network, it gathers again into an efferent arteriole, and that efferent arteriole then drops out. So this was the glomerulus here, and the afferent arteriole drops down and kind of wraps around this loop of nephron material, of kidney material. And here you can see more of these peritubular capillary networks. So here is where we do some gas exchange. So so we have, if you recall, when you have two capillary networks, one right after the other, that's referred to as a portal system. So here's the renal portal system. So the blood flows first to the capillaries of the glomerulus, and then rejoins, and the vessels rejoin into the efferent arteriole, and then it travels to the peritubular capillaries, and here's where we see gas exchange. And so on the far side of this peritubular capillary network, then the vessels merge again to form the cortical radiate veins. So all of this, the blue, imagine that this blue is now finding its way back up and merging into one of these cortical radiate veins, and then the cortical radiate veins are bringing their blood down to this blue arcuate vein. So the naming mirrors exactly the naming of the arteries. So the arcuate vein then leads to an interlobar vein, and we have a couple of arcuate veins that will merge to form the interlobar veins, and eventually all of that blood will exit the kidney at the renal veins. So out goes the blood. So came in at the renal artery, then to interlobar arteries, to arcuate arteries, to cortical radiate arteries, to the afferent arteriole, to the glomerulus, to the efferent arteriole, to the peritubular capillaries. And I want you to spend some time working on this whole pathway of blood flow. So from the peritubular capillaries then into the cortical radiate veins, to the arcuate veins, to the interlobar veins, and finally to the renal vein. So there you have it, the functions of the kidney, some kidney structure, and then an outline of the pathway that blood takes as it's flowing to, through, and away from the kidney. You know what to do. If you have any questions, give me a holla on email, or you can meet me during office hours.